Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowed corners of Victorian society, where women were suffocating under the weight of rigid roles, yet some of them managed to squirm free. The Victorian era is often remembered for its strict morality, its obsession with order, and its deeply entrenched gender roles. Women were seen as delicate, pious beings whose greatest virtues were their modesty, submission, and devotion to family. But not every woman accepted these limits. Some fought against the boundaries of their time, some struggled quietly, and others used their intelligence, their charm, and even their beauty to gain access to power. It was a time when a woman's greatest ambition was to secure a good marriage, and anything beyond that was seen as unnatural, almost sinful. But as history shows, when you shove a people into a corner, they eventually push back. So if you're into strange and fascinating tales from history, take a moment to like the video what I do here, but let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. They're to begin with the suffocating walls Victorian women found themselves trapped in. For most women of the era, the idea of power was completely out of reach. Society didn't just encourage passivity, it required it. Women's education was limited, their rights were stripped down to almost nothing, and their legal standing was entirely dependent on the men in their lives. Women could vote, they couldn't own property, and in most cases, they could even sign their own legal documents without their husband's approval. It was a suffocating reality, one that left most women with little more than the power to maintain a household and birth children. But what happens when you're forced into a corner? Well, some women fought back, quietly, obsessively, with every ounce of their being. It wasn't all tragic though. Some women became masters of their destiny, using the only tools available to them: charm, cunning, and the ability to manipulate their circumstances. They didn't necessarily tear down the walls of their society, but they did find cracks in the structure. They used their limited power to push through, carve out their own space, and create influence in a world that would prefer they remain invisible. One example, Queen Victoria herself, the matriarch of the empire. She may have been a symbol of the ideal Victorian woman. But make no mistake, she was also a savvy political player, using her position and marriage to Prince Albert to strengthen the British monarchy. But despite Queen Victoria's ability to leverage her position, not all women had the same luxury. For most women, their struggles were rooted in a more personal, everyday reality. Take, for instance, the plight of the working-class women. These women didn't have palaces or royal titles. They had nothing but their wits and their resilience. Without the ability to own property or even control their own wages, they were at the mercy of men, whether it be their fathers, husbands, or brothers. The world outside their homes was far less forgiving, and women like them were often confined to roles as servants, factory workers, or housewives. Yet, despite these limitations, some women found ways to fight. It wasn't always through outright defiance or rebellion. Sometimes it was through subtle manipulation, using their influence in the domestic sphere to gain leverage. They understood the power dynamics at play in their households and could manipulate these dynamics to carve out more autonomy. They may not have been able to vote or own property, but they learned how to use the few tools at their disposal. In the workplace, women like mill workers or domestic servants found solidarity with their fellow women, and this connection allowed them to challenge the status quo, even if only in small ways. One example of this was the development of women's work as an economic sector. Women, especially in urban areas, started to create their own networks, organizing themselves into unions and advocating for better working conditions and wages. The Industrial Revolution, which had dramatically shifted the structure of society, also shifted the balance of power for many women. It was an era of massive social and economic upheaval, and it gave women an opportunity to create new spaces for themselves. It's easy to imagine how the loud machines of the factory floor might drown out the voices of women, but in fact, the women working there were the ones organizing for better conditions. They recognized that despite their lack of political power, they could use their collective strength to challenge the men who held authority over them. But even the quietest forms of resistance were enough to make some men uneasy. The idea of women having any form of power, whether it was control over their own household, was something society wasn't prepared to accept. The idea that women could organize, could demand more rights, could stand up to their male superiors, terrified the establishment, and so in response, society doubled down on its attempts to suppress these movements. Women were often labeled as hysterical, irrational, or simply unnatural, if they exhibited any desire for independence. In some cases, they were even diagnosed with female hysteria and sent to asylums for their beliefs. But even in the face of this, the women pushing against the societal walls were not easily dissuaded. Some women, like Florence Nightingale, turned their attentions to the medical field, proving that women had the intellectual capacity to contribute to important fields of study. Others, like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, broke into the male-dominated medical profession, becoming one of the first women to become a physician in Britain. It was in these quiet yet highly significant ways that women began to chip away at the walls of their society. These women didn't just change their own lives, they changed the course of history. Meanwhile, the suffrage movement, a powerful and increasingly popular push for women to gain the right to vote, was gaining traction. Women like Emmeline Pankhurst, who would become one of the most famous suffragettes in history, were beginning to rally women to take action. Pankhurst was known for her bold tactics and unrelenting spirit, even when faced with imprisonment, hunger strikes, and social isolation. Yet it wasn't just the radical actions of Pankhurst and her suffragettes that were inspiring. There was also the quieter, more systematic work of suffragists, like Millicent Fawcett, who pushed for gradual legal reforms. Their fight was not just for the right to vote, it was a fight for recognition, for respect, and for the simple acknowledgement that women were capable of shaping the future. While Pankhurst and her followers resorted to militant tactics, Fawcett and other suffragists were more diplomatic, but both groups shared the belief that women in voices mattered. They believed that women could contribute to society in more meaningful ways than simply caring for their homes and children. It was, and still is, an idea that challenges the foundations, the patriarchal society, an idea that would slowly but surely take hold in the hearts and minds of the British public. The seeds of rebellion against the gendered status quo were planted, and though they take decades to fully bloom, they began to sprout in small radical groups across England. The stage was being set for a revolution, not of violence, but of words, of ideas, and of women's collective will to claim a space in a world that had always excluded them. The pushback from society was fierce, but the women, fighting for their rights, understood that their struggle was not just for their own futures, but for the futures of their daughters, granddaughters, and all the generations to come. The suffrage movement, though ignited by the struggles of working-class women, had also attracted a new breed of political activists, women from the upper echelons of society. These were women who had inherited wealth and power, women who had never known the same economic hardships as the mill girls or domestic servants, but who shared the same fierce desire for autonomy. One of the most notable among them was Emmeline Pankhurst, whose tireless campaigning would eventually define the suffrage movement in Britain. She was not the first to champion the cause, but she would become the most infamous. Beside Emmeline, there were women like Millicent Fawcett, a staunch suffragist who believed in gradual peaceful reform. Fawcett's approach was more methodical, lobbying Parliament for small victories, hoping that each step would bring them closer to their goal of women's rights. But this was not enough for Emmeline Pankhurst, whose frustration with slow progress led her to found the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, in 1903. The WSPU was not your average suffrage group. It was a direct action organisation that used disruptive tactics to draw attention to the cause. Pankhurst and her followers, many of whom came from privileged backgrounds, resorted to militant protests, chaining themselves to railings, throwing rocks through windows, and even engaging in hunger strikes to demand the vote. Pankhurst's tactics shocked the establishment, and many people condemned her and her followers for their radicalism. They were labelled as hysterical women, fanatics, and dangerous troublemakers. But the more they were ridiculed, the more determined they became. What society failed to see, and what the suffragettes understood all too well, was that their very actions, so ones that riled the public, were forcing society to reckon with the question of women in place in the world. By acting out of bounds, they were breaking the invisible chains that had confined them for centuries. The suffragettes were radical, but their radicalism was not born of whimsy or violence for its own sake. They were responding to the oppressive systems that had relegated them to second-class citizens for so long. At this point in history, women had been voiceless, powerless in the eyes of the law, and largely invisible in the political sphere. In the face of all this, their desire to be heard and seen wasn't just an ideal key, it was a survival instinct. For many, the fight for the vote was the first step towards securing basic human rights. However, the backlash against the suffragettes was fierce. Pankhurst and her followers were imprisoned for their protests, often subjected to force feeding during their hunger strikes, but every act of violence against them seemed only to galvanize their resolve. Their suffering became a powerful symbol for the broader suffrage movement. They were no longer just fighting for the vote, they were fighting for their dignity. But while the suffragettes were making headlines with their dramatic actions, other women were working within the system to push for change. Millicent Fawcett's more diplomatic approach was slow but steady, and eventually the combined pressure of both the suffragists and suffragettes would lead to the Representation of the People Act in 1918. This act granted women over the age of 30 the right to vote. It wasn't a complete victory. Women still did not have equal voting rights with men, but it was a major step forward and a recognition that the women movement could no longer be ignored. What was fascinating about this shift, though, was how the press and public opinion slowly started to change. At the beginning of the suffrage movement, women had been dismissed as weak, incapable of understanding the complexities of politics. They were treated as little more than over-emotional creatures, driven by vanity and rebellion. But the suffragettes, unrelenting, perseverant, despite imprisonment, torture, and ridicule, the movement was no longer seen as a small fringe of hysterical women. It became a growing, undeniable force that could no longer be dismissed. In the years that followed, the suffrage movement sparked a wave of other social reforms. Women began to push for better access to education, the right to work, and even the right to control their own property. The suffrage victory was a turning point, but it was by no means the end. It was a beginning. Women had made their voices heard, and now they would demand to be heard in every aspect of society. But the fight for women's rights was not without its internal conflicts. As the suffrage movement grew in prominence, tensions between the more radical suffragettes and the moderate suffragists began to surface. The suffragettes, with their militancy, were seen as an embarrassment by some of their more conservative counterparts. The radicalism of the suffragettes did not sit well with those who preferred gradual reform, as they feared it would damage their cause in the long run. The suffragettes, for their part, were frustrated with the suffragists' slow progress, feeling that their more passive approach would never lead to the rapid change they demanded. But in the end, it wasn't the suffragists or the suffragettes alone who won the vote for women. It was the tireless work of both sides, working in tandem, pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable, and forcing society to reconsider the role of women. They may have had different methods, but their ultimate goal was the same: women rights, women in voice, and women in power. In the wake of the suffrage victory, the women in movement didn't slow down. It was just beginning. Women began to carve out spaces in professional and academic fields, pushing into industries that had long been closed off to them. But the struggle for equality was still far from over. The suffrage movement had opened the door, but women still had to fight for access to education, equal pay, and protection from the laws that had long kept them in subordinate roles. But one thing had changed. Women had found their voice, and no amount of backlash or societal resistance could silence them now. As the suffrage movement began to gain traction, it was clear that the women who had driven the cause forward, Emmeline Pankhurst, Millicent Fawcett, and their allies, had shattered the glass ceiling of Victorian expectations. But what about the millions of women who didn't have the privilege of high status, influence, or the luxury of time to engage in activism? The working class women of Victorian England, those who laboured in factories, homes and fields, had a different set of struggles. They didn't have the same opportunities to engage in political actions like the suffragists and suffragettes, yet they too found ways to fight against the suffocating social norms that had been forced upon them. Working class women had a far more immediate practical battle on their hands. The majority of Victorian women lived in poverty, and for those in the working class, their lives were shaped by labour conditions that were brutal and unforgiving. Women worked long hours in factories, earning a fraction of what their male counterparts. Yet even in these harsh conditions they found ways to challenge the status quo. One such group was the mill girls, mean women working in the cotton mills across England. These women were among the first to organize in the industrial age. Faced with grueling hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions, they began to demand better treatment. They were often joined by their male counterparts, but it was the mill girls who were some of the first to strike, to form unions, and to demand improvements despite their limited rights. These women showed that collective action could yield real change. They proved that even in the most difficult circumstances, women could fight for better working conditions, better pay, and better lives. Their activism, although often ignored by the elite, laid the foundation for the broader labour movements that would eventually sweep across the country. But while many women in the working class were busy fighting for economic rights, others turned their attention to the cause of social reform. One of the most important, who became the face of the movement to abolish the Banning Contagious Diseases Act, which allowed the police to arrest women suspected of being prostitutes and force them to undergo. The law was seen as a way to control the spread of venereal diseases, but in practice, it was a cruel and discriminatory system that disproportionately targeted women. Josephine Butler Tyler's campaigning against these laws became one of the most significant achievements in the history of women's rights in Britain. Her work highlighted how social and legal systems were stacked against women, and her efforts eventually led to the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts in 1886. Butler's work demonstrated the ways in which Victorian society viewed women not as autonomous individuals, but as property to be controlled and regulated. But it wasn't just women in the working class who were fighting for rights. Middle-class women too had their own battles. They were trapped in a different set of expectations, ones that revolved around their roles as wives and mothers. For them, the fight for power was about more than just political rights. It was about social recognition too. In many ways, these women were the most restricted, as their lives were often defined by their husbands' careers, their family reputation, and their roles within their homes. These women had few avenues for personal expression or independence. One middle-class woman who defied these constraints was Florence Nightingale. Born into privilege, Nightingale could have lived a life of ease, enjoying the comforts that came with her status. But instead, she became one of the most pioneering figures in the history of nursing, revolutionizing healthcare in Victorian Britain. Nightingale worked during the Crimean War not only saved countless lives, but it also fundamentally changed the role of women in the medical profession by establishing nursing as a respected field of work. She broke down the social barriers that had traditionally kept women from entering healthcare. In doing so, she also proved that women could have an impact in fields of public service. But even Nightingale's accomplishments were framed by Victorian expectations. She was lauded for her work as a nurse and health reformer, but her role was always seen as secondary to that of the male doctors who worked alongside her. This gendered hierarchy still exists today in many professions, where women often face obstacles in their professional advancement. Nightingale's legacy was significant, but it was also limited by the structures of power that defined the era. The rise of social reformers like Butler and Nightingale in the middle class created a cultural shift in how women were viewed. Though their efforts were not always recognized or celebrated in their time, these women demonstrated that there was more to womanhood than domesticity. Their work showed that women could be intellectuals, activists, and leaders in their own right, and they paved the way for future generations of women to challenge the status quo in even more radical ways. And while the suffrage movement was gaining momentum, it wasn't just in the political sphere that women were making waves. They were starting to make their mark in culture too. The rise of women writers and artists during the Victorian era was another sign that women were claiming space outside of their traditional roles. Writers like the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning challenged the notion that women could only write about domestic life or the home. They wrote about politics, religion, and social justice, giving voice to women's experiences and perspectives that had long been ignored. In the visual arts, women like Preophyalite, painter Elizabeth Sviddle, and sculptor Mary Cassatt broke through traditional gender roles, proving that women could excel in the creative fields as well. However, the reception of these women works was often tinged with skepticism. Many critics could not fathom that a woman could produce art on par with that of their male counterpart. Yet despite these criticisms, these women persisted. Their art became an important part of the broader cultural fabric, inspiring future generations of women artists and writers to follow in their footsteps. What all of these women had in common was an unwavering belief in their right to exist on their own terms. They fought against the idea that their value was solely tied to their roles as wives and mothers. They fought for the right to define their own identities, to pursue careers, and to contribute to society in meaningful ways. While they may not have always succeeded in their own lifetimes, their efforts were not in vain. These women laid the groundwork for the battles that would follow, for the rights the future generations of women would one day enjoy. The Victorian era, with all its societal pressures and gendered expectations, was a time of extraordinary change for women. Despite the limitations they faced, women found ways to fight back, whether through political activism, social reform, or artistic expression. The women who shaped this era were not just fighting for their own freedoms. They were fighting for the freedom of future generations. And in doing so, they helped to redefine what it meant to be a woman. In a rapidly changing world, the changing landscape of Victorian society, which was increasingly shaped by women activism, wasn't without its pushback. With each progressive step, there was an equally fierce effort to maintain the status quo. For every suffragette who chained herself to a railing in the name of women and rights, there was a voice on the other side decrying the disruption of mononatural. The Victorian establishment feared that women gaining power, whether in politics, education, or the workforce, would unhinge the carefully constructed system that had kept society in its rigid place. But despite this, the walls of patriarchal society were slowly beginning to crack. Women were asserting their power in ways that no one could ignore, and their influence was becoming undeniable. The debate about women in roles was no longer confined to the edges of society. It was front and center in every public discourse. Yet, even as women made headway, the societal backlash grew louder and more insistent. One of the greatest fears the establishment had about empowered women was the fear of the unruly woman. It's the idea that a woman who refused to adhere to her prescribed role was a danger to society. This notion was so deeply ingrained in Victorian culture that it became the foundation for many of the laws and social attitudes directed toward women. Women who defied societal expectations were not just seen as wrong, they were seen as dangerous. This idea of the bitter, unruly woman was weaponized to silence those pushing for greater rights, such as the suffragists and suffragettes. The backlash against these women often manifested in their public ridicule. Take, for example, the media treatment of Emmeline Pankhurst and her suffragettes. They were vilified as hysterical, irrational, and violent, despite the fact that many of their actions were in direct response to the violent treatment they had received from the authorities. When they were force-fed during their hunger strikes, it was seen as a form of protest, a defiance of the physical constraints of the body. The act of hunger striking was a final appeal to the humanity of the British public, a deliberate attempt to make the invisible visible. Yet, the establishment used this to portray them as deviant and mad, not as fighters for justice. But this view of women in activism as unnatural wasn't limited to the suffragettes. It was part of a much broader cultural fear of powerful women. Women who dared to enter public life, to speak out, or to challenge gender norms were often seen as a threat to the established order. And for those women who were involved in the fight for suffrage, their very existence outside the home was seen as a radical act. This was particularly true for women of the upper classes, who had traditionally been seen as guardians of propriety and decorum. When they stepped outside of this role, they faced harsh criticism, not just from the media, but from other women as well. In many ways, these upper-class women were expected to be the moral examples for others to follow, and when they defied their role as bumpous women, it created a cultural crisis. One of the most significant debates that arose during this time was whether women could be trusted with political power. Could they be trusted to vote, to hold office, or to influence the law? The fear that women would use their new political freedoms to upset the natural order was pervasive. The idea of being a feminine influence was often invoked as a warning. This so-called influence was viewed as something dangerous, something that could corrupt the moral fabric of society. Women power, it was believed, lay in their ability to influence their husbands, fathers, and sons. With the thought of women acting independently, one of the key debates that centered around the bitter, unruly woman was the idea of motherhood. In Victorian society, a woman's primary role was as a mother, and her power was expected to manifest in her ability to guide the next generation. A woman's identity was often defined by her capacity for maternal care, and the greatest fear of the establishment was that women who were outside the home working, agitating, protesting, would lose touch with their maternity. For many, the idea of women stepping out of their domestic roles wasn't just a threat to the family, it was a threat to civilization itself. But despite these fears, women continued to push for change. They continued to assert their rights, their independence, and their power. And in doing so, they changed the very definition of womanhood. No longer was a woman's identity tied solely to her role as a wife or mother. Women in the Victorian era, through their activism, their work, and their intellectual contributions, began to redefine what it meant to be a woman in a rapidly changing world. The legal landscape was also shifting, albeit slowly. While women still couldn't vote and had very limited legal rights, the laws surrounding women's property and marriage began to change. The Married Women Property Act of 1882, for example, allowed women to own property in their own right, a radical departure from the previous laws that treated women as legal non-entities under their husbands. This law, while far from perfect, was an important step toward legal autonomy, and as the suffrage movement gained momentum, women's voices were heard in Parliament demanding more legal rights and protections. Yet, even as legal changes were made, the social and cultural forces that kept women in their place were still deeply entrenched. Women who gained legal rights still faced prejudice, judgment, and fear, but each change, each small victory, paved the way for the larger shifts to come. It was the relentless push for change, despite the setbacks, that eventually turned the tide in women's favor. By the time World War I arrived, the battle for women's rights had become inextricably linked to the larger changes in British society. The war itself was a catalyst for women in greater involvement in public life. As they stepped into roles that had once been reserved for men, women worked in factories, served in military support roles, and contributed to the war effort in ways that had never been seen before. The impact of this collective work would prove to be a turning point. It showed that women were not only capable of contributing to the national good, they were essential to it. The war effort helped to shift public opinion, and after the war, women were granted the right to vote in 1918, albeit with restrictions. The backlash against powerful women, however, didn't disappear. It continued to be a force throughout the 20th century, with women facing new challenges in every decade. But the suffrage movement had proven that despite the resistance, women could fight for their rights and change the course of history. The bitter, unruly woman, once seen as a threat to society, became a symbol of empowerment, a reminder that the fight for equality would always require courage, defiance, and persistence. As the suffrage movement secured women in political power, the ripple effects spread far beyond the vote. Women in the Victorian era had not only fought for the right to participate in the democratic process, they had fought for the very right to be seen as fully human, capable of intellectual rigor, social leadership, and political engagement. Their struggle did not stop with the passage of the Representation of the People Act in 1918. Instead, it laid the foundation for the broader feminist movements of the 20th century and beyond. The social and cultural landscape had already begun to change. The success of the suffrage movement wasn't just a political victory. It was a fundamental shift in how women were viewed in society. In the years following the first partial victory in 1918, women started to push for more rights. The right to work freely, to have access to education, to enter professions once closed off to them, and to live independent lives. These battles, which began with the right to vote, were part of a larger struggle for personal autonomy. In the aftermath of the Great War, society was forced to confront the contributions women had made in the home front. The war had shown just how capable women were when they were given the opportunity. Many had taken over jobs that had once been exclusively held by men: factory work, engineering, teaching, and even positions in local government. This shifting tide of gender roles helped to name the idea of women working outside the home. Although women were still overwhelmingly expected to return to their traditional roles after the war. However, despite the setback of the post-war gender retrenchment, the momentum for change never fully ceased. The suffragettes who fought for the vote now turned their attention to broader social reform. Emmeline Pankhurst's post-suffrage work continued to focus on women's rights, and the newly empowered political activists of the early 20th century advocated for workplace rights, equal pay, and reproductive rights. Their fight was not just about gaining political equality, it was about dismantling the power structures that had kept women in servitude for centuries. They recognized that without true economic freedom, political rights would be meaningless. The struggle for women's rights was also deeply connected to the growing movements for labor and social reform. As women began to join trade unions and demand better working conditions, they found solidarity with working-class men and women, many of whom were fighting against the same oppressive systems. The increasing visibility of women in the workforce during and after the war reinforced the idea that women could be powerful agents of social change both inside and outside the home. Yet, even as progress was made, the backlash against women's rights continued. Critics of the suffrage movement feared the bin and Rudy woman would disrupt the natural order, and indeed, the social order continued to be disturbed in the decades that followed. Women who pushed for more rights were often labeled as dangerous radicals, and many were ostracized for their advocacy of reproductive rights and gender equality. The resistance to feminism was not just political, it was deeply cultural. The fear of an unruly woman continued to haunt women who sought greater autonomy in 1928. The Equal Franchise Act finally granted women equal voting rights with men, allowing women over the age of 21 the right to vote, regardless of their marital status or property ownership. This was a monumental step in the fight for gender equality. But it was just one chapter in a much longer story. By the mid-20th century, feminist movements would continue to fight for equality in the workplace, the right to choose and protection from gender-based violence. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s built on the foundation laid by the suffragists and suffragettes, with women demanding not just political rights, but full comprehensive equality in every facet of life. The story of Victorian women fight for power is one of defiance, endurance, and transformation. From the suffragists to the suffragettes, from the mill girls to the reformers, each woman who fought for her right to exist on her own terms left a legacy that reverberates today. The brave women who broke through the walls of their society did not simply challenge gender norms. They redefined them. What is perhaps the most remarkable element of this struggle is the sheer tenacity of the women involved. Every small victory, every legal change, every protest, every piece of written work was a step towards something bigger. These women knew that their efforts weren't just for their own benefit. They were fighting for future generations. They were paving the way for women to live in a world where they could speak freely, where they could work for a living, where they could participate in politics, and where they could control their own bodies. As we look back on the suffrage movement and the broader struggle for women's rights, it's clear that these women didn't just change their own lives. They changed the course of history. Their bravery in the face of resistance, their persistence in the fight for equality, and their refusal to be silenced left an indelible mark on the world. Today we stand on their shoulders enjoying rights and freedoms that were once unthinkable. But we must remember that the fight for equality is ongoing. The victories of the Victorian suffragists and suffragettes are just one chapter in a longer, ever-evolving story of women in struggle for power. The legacy of these Victorian women, and the countless others who fought silently or in the margins, is one that will continue to inspire generations of women and men alike. Their story is a reminder that the path to equality is rarely smooth, but it is always worth the struggle.